Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of this lecture focused on other possibilities for data generation with me, Victoria Clark. In part 2 we're going to focus on qualitative surveys. The 3 parts of this lecture are relatively self-contained, so it's not crucial that you have listened to the introducing other possibilities part 1 section yet. But this is part 2, obviously, qualitative surveys, and then in part 3 we'll be looking at story completion and vignettes. These slides are part of a collaboration between Virginia Brown on the left, Nikki Hayfield on the right, and me, Victoria Clark, in the middle, creating resources for online teaching and learning on qualitative methods. So in this part of the session we're going to focus on qualitative surveys, what they are and when you want to use them, what they're good for and so on. We'll look at survey design and some of the different possibilities for formatting and delivering qualitative surveys. We'll share some examples of qualitative surveys from psychotherapy and mental health research. And then finally we'll think about some of the pros and cons, the opportunities and possibilities and constraints of qualitative surveys. So qualitative surveys are basically where you present participants with a series of open-ended, but sometimes closed-ended, substantive topic-focused questions where they are invited to respond to the questions in their own words. So they're normally delivered remotely, because if you were actually asking the participants the questions directly and interacting with them, this would essentially be an interview. So surveys involve some degree of distance between the researcher and the participant. So the questions are open-ended in the sense that you want participants to respond in their own words, but sometimes you might have a closed question and then ask people to please explain their answer. So sometimes that might be the most effective way of getting people to kind of share their experiences and their views and so on. So they can also include closed questions in the substantive section, but these will always have a prompt to encourage people to kind of share their experiences. You don't want people responding yes, no, and one-word answers and so on. And there'll also typically be some demographic questions. So in qualitative research, generally it's considered good practice to be able to describe the characteristics of your participant group, and if necessary in the discussion reflect on the limitations of that. So in order to describe participants you need to ask people some demographic questions, but this often has to be balanced against concerns with participant anonymity. So you want enough information to be able to describe the participant group, but not so much that you're compromising participants' anonymity. Qualitative surveys can be a standalone method, or they can be used in a project where other methods have used as well. So what several of my students have done over the years is give people a choice of how they respond. So you can take part in an interview, you can do a survey, you can participate in a focus group. So it gives participants kind of flexibility in how they want to engage with the research. And in qualitative research, this isn't a problem. In big Q qualitative research, it isn't a problem because we're not concerned about standardization. In data collection, what we're concerned about is allowing participants to participate in a way that's best for them and allows them to kind of share their story, their experiences and their views with us. There are lots of reasons why you might want to use a qualitative survey and particular circumstances where they seem to work very well. So they can be useful to explore lived experience and also perceptions and understandings and views and needs and so on. And they've been used to explore a wide range of topics. They're particularly good for sensitive topics, and this is because they have a strong sense of kind of felt anonymity. Participants feel anonymous, whether they actually are anonymous. Survey software, for example, collects but hides IP addresses, so you could potentially kind of work out the building a participant was in when they completed the study, but in terms of what it feels like for participants, it feels very anonymous. And so these two things together, sensitive topic, anonymity, can be really important. One of my students was using a survey in a sex research project, and one of the participants also wanted to be interviewed, and what she found was there was far more explicit detail, far more disclosure in the survey than in the interview. So for some topics, surveys do seem to work incredibly well. They're also good when participants don't have the time to commit to an interview, or they need flexibility. They need to be able to control when and how they take part, and you can set up online surveys so people can take part over several sessions. They don't necessarily have to complete the survey in one go. Another student looked at when participants were completing her survey, and she noticed that they were completing either very early in the morning or quite late at night, times when you wouldn't necessarily kind of take part in an interview. So one thing that surveys have is lots of flexibility, and then that strong sense of kind of felt anonymity. They're also really useful when you don't need a lot of data from individual participants. So interviews are about depth and kind of really getting to grips with the nitty-gritty of an aspect of people's kind of experience or their views. If you just have a few questions that you want to explore with people, you don't need a lot of information from each individual participant. Surveys can be a good option. They're also great if participant groups are scattered, so you can use an online survey and it doesn't matter where people are in the country or indeed where they are in the world, because they can take part because everything's online. So there's lots of reasons why surveys can be good, why they can work well. So the first thing you need to think about when designing your survey is how you're going to deliver it to participants. To a certain extent, this is sort of a non-question in many ways these days, because most surveys are online. It's easy, it's efficient, the survey software is there, it's great, it works well. Hard copy completion can still be used. There might be circumstances or participant groups that prefer this option. Email, again, use less because there's concerns around GDPR regulations and the sharing of data over email. So that has become less common, but that also might be a possibility depending on the needs of the participant group. But in most instances now, qualitative surveys are delivered online. When it comes to designing survey questions, the key thing you need to hold in mind is there's no opportunity for clarification, as there would be in an interview or a focus group where people can check what you mean, or I didn't quite understand that. So in surveys, you've got to make sure the questions are clear and participants understand what you want in response to a particular question, not necessarily how you want them to answer it, but what kind of information that you're looking for. So questions need to be open and open-ended, but as I previously mentioned, sometimes closed questions followed by please explain your answer can be the clearest and simplest way to convey what it is you want to know. So if it's not working, if you're trying to design a question and you can't get it to work as an open-ended question, consider that option of closed but followed by please explain. That doesn't seem to have an impact on the kind of quality of data you get. Those kind of please explain questions seem to work quite well. You want to think about how to word the question. You want to keep it really clear and simple and make sure the terminology you're using resonates for the participant group. You might want to explain particular terminology if there isn't always a clear understanding of what things mean. You definitely want to ask one question at a time. If you think about when you phone up a call center and they ask you for your date of birth and your postcode, my brain immediately goes, oh, two different bits of information. So you want to avoid participants having that feeling. It's very clear what you want to know, and you want to avoid them not answering a bit of the question because you've essentially asked two questions at once. So when you're designing a survey, you're going to put quite a bit of effort and energy into getting the wording right, and also on deciding the best order for the questions. So you probably want to start with some broader questions or some of the least sensitive questions, and then work your way up to more specific questions and more sensitive questions. And of course you can pilot your survey as well, so you can check with a small number of participants if it's working, if people understand what you're asking with particular questions and so on. Other things you need to think about when you're designing and delivering your survey are, is it pretty? Does it look nice? The advantage of online surveys and using the platform we have at UE, Qualtrics, means that it will look pretty, it will look nice. You just need to make sure that the bits you write all look nice and professional. You want to make sure that it's easy for people to follow. You want to make sure that it's not too long, so participants tend to kind of roll off surveys if they're too long, if they get bored, if they get fed up, if they've got to do lots of kind of clicking or scrolling through it. So you want to think about the participants' experience of completing the survey. So in Qualtrics, if you're designing an online survey, you can use the preview function so you can see what participants see, and that helps you to get a real feel of what it's like to complete the survey. As I mentioned, you might need to think about, do I need to explain this terminology for participants so they understand what I mean when I say this particular term? You need to be really clear with participants about what's expected, what's required of them, so what kinds of questions they're going to be asked to answer, how long it might take them to complete the survey. One bit of feedback I've heard is someone was taking a part in a survey and they were said that it would take 30 minutes and it took them 90, and they were pleased that they'd done it, but they felt kind of annoyed that it sort of really underplayed how long it would take. So it's worth kind of bearing that in mind. You want to make sure that you give participants enough information so they can give fully informed consent, so they understand what the survey is going to focus on, the kinds of questions that they're going to be asked to answer. Obviously, you need to think about demographic questions and what you need to know about your participant group in order to describe them appropriately and reflect on the limitations. And think also about confidentiality and anonymity. And if you're not using an online survey, you need to think about how participants are going to return the survey. So if it's a hard copy completion, how are they going to get it back to you? And thank participants at the end, and also think about whether you use a debrief in inverted commas. For me as a psychologist, I always associate debriefing with the concealment of research aims in quantitative research, but in qualitative research it can still be useful to kind of have a check-in at the end, and you want to repeat kind of key information for participants, so how they can withdraw, sources of support, and so on. Okay, so we've got an example here of a qualitative survey study that was conducted by one of my former counselling psychology students, Louise Davey, supervised by me and Liz Jenkinson. And she was focusing on participants' experiences of living with alopecia, an autoimmune hair loss condition. We decided to go for a survey, or Louise decided to go for a survey, because there wasn't a lot of qualitative research out there on lived experience. So the advantages of surveys is they give you a wide-angled lens. They allow you to collect data from lots of participants kind of relatively easily and get a sense of the broader experience of a particular group of participants. And also because it was a sensitive topic and participants might feel awkward and uncomfortable kind of meeting a researcher for an interview, that might feel pressured, and they might value the anonymity of a survey. Convenient sampling, so Louise used different kinds of recruitment strategies to get access to people with alopecia, and 95 participants completed the survey, so she had a lot of data. So for a professional doctorate thesis, I'd probably say somewhere between sort of 80 and 100 participants, but you want to keep an eye on the data as it comes in. And for a master's dissertation, probably at least 30 is a good number, but again, you want to keep an eye on the data, how rich it is, how detailed the responses are. And Louise delivered the survey online using Qualtrics. So we spent a lot of time thinking about the question wording, and Louise also piloted the survey on a small group of participants to get a sense of how the questions were working. They were typically open-ended, encouraging people to respond in their own words, and the early questions were quite broad and asked about people's first experiences of alopecia and how it impacts on their day-to-day life. And then the later questions address more kind of specific issues, so seeking information, seeking support, how they think they're perceived by other people. And then, as is good practice in interviews as well as qualitative surveys, there was what we call a clean-up question at the end. So is there anything else you'd like to share with us. This gives participants an opportunity to kind of share things that they think are important and that we haven't anticipated based on our own experience and understanding of the literature. And sometimes you can get really exciting and interesting data in response to that final cleanup question that kind of takes the research in new directions. So it's always really important to include that both in interviews, focus groups, and qualitative surveys. The final Living with Alopecia survey had 10 questions, and we decided that this was a good amount given that we were asking people about kind of lived experience, and so we wanted them to engage kind of in depth and detail with their lived experience in responding to the survey. This gave Louise the information that she needed for her analysis, but it also balanced considerations with not kind of tiring participants out and asking too much of them. So the first question was really open and general. Please tell me about your experience of starting to lose your hair. And you note there that it's framed in a relational way. So it's telling the participants that there's a researcher asking this question. So it sort of builds that relationship. So that can be a useful technique for helping participants to think about the fact that they're kind of telling a story to a human being, and that even though there's a lot of distance here, they're kind of entering into a relationship with someone. And then the questions become more specific, so and asking about how alopecia affects day-to-day life and how people think other people perceive them. And then questions moved on to people's sense of self and their identity, as well as changes in their experience over time. So we thought a lot about the wording of the questions, but also getting that order right as well. And that's two things that you can focus on in piloting. Is the wording working? Are people interpreting it in the way that I want them to, and is the order of the questions working as well? So you can just get people to complete the survey and then make a judgment based on how people respond, or you can explicitly ask people for feedback on the survey, on the question wording and the question ordering and so on. So towards the end of the survey, there was a question about seeking information and about counselling and psychological support. And Louise decided, after reading the data and the responses to these questions, that there weren't many people within the participant group that had experiences of counselling. So she decided to do a small number of interviews. I think it was 6 with people that had had counselling in order to be able to say more about people with alopecia's experiences of counselling. So that is an example of how you can kind of have two methods kind of working together. 2 of the questions were sort of yes/no questions, and then participants were directed to different sub-questions depending on their answer. So this is something that you can do very easily in Qualtrics. You can kind of filter people to different questions depending on how they respond to an initial question. So have you ever been offered counselling or psychological support to help you cope with having alopecia? And then depending on how people answered, they were directed to another question. So it was, tell me about that, or I think the no one was, would you find it useful to have counselling? So this is another useful thing that you can do in an online survey. It's harder to do in hard copy, because if you think about if you've ever completed a hard copy kind of questionnaire or form and it if no, go to 5A and so on, it can be a bit confusing. And then, as I've mentioned, we have that cleanup question at the end where people can kind of share anything that they think is important that they don't feel has been raised by previous questions. I think something really useful to know about survey data is the responses often seem quite short, but then when you come to analyse it, it feels like a lot of data. Survey data is quite different from interview data. It's very dense with meaning. It's very focused and on target, whereas interview data is a bit more sort of meandering and loose. And so when you're coding survey data, you often have lots and lots and lots of codes because it's quite dense with meaning, because people are very focused in how they're responding. And the data that the alopecia survey generated was really rich. It was very varied. People had quite different experiences, and it really captured the complexity and the contradictions of kind of living with alopecia. So from the data that was generated, it validated the choice to use surveys. It worked well for this participant group, for this topic, and so on. So the paper's on Blackboard if you'd like to read it. And you'll see that in the published paper there are quotations from the survey data. The paper's published in a medical journal, and they tend to separate out data and narrative. So all the data's in tables, and then you have the narrative separately. So if you're not used to it, it can be a bit hard to read. The data were analysed with thematic analysis, and I think we started out with 5 themes, and then they were sort of rejigged and reorganised into 4 themes. And the first one kind of captured the way that hair is often seen as something trivial, but for the participants losing the hair was a really profound experience, and at the same time they felt unentitled to sympathy because there was nothing, in quotes, seriously wrong with them. So they were often mistaken for people undergoing cancer treatment and got sympathy as a result, and felt that they weren't entitled to that sympathy. But nonetheless, the experience of losing their hair was profoundly distressing, and for some participants they compared it to kind of a bereavement or an amputation. So there was lots of kind of complex emotions around losing hair. The second theme captured the way participants felt their life was restricted through this, that they often stayed indoors, that they avoided social activities because they felt really uncomfortable about their hair loss. And then this is kind of a play on a phrase, abandon hope, all you who lose their hair, was a sense of hopelessness that participants often felt because there were no effective medical treatments. If treatments worked, they worked on a temporary basis, and so there was a lack of hope, a sense that there was nothing that could be done for them. And then the final theme explored people's experiences of kind of seeking support, and what people wanted from support and needed from support was often highly different and varied. So there are some other empirical examples of qualitative survey research here. The hyperlinks take you to the papers in either the library or on an open access repository if you want to read them. So there's some counselling and some music therapy examples to give you a sense of what survey research looks like in practice and the range of topics that can be explored using surveys. So before moving on to the next slide, I'd encourage you to pause the recording and have a think about what you think the strengths of qualitative surveys are, or one particular strength, and then one particular weakness. If you've got an idea that you'd like to explore in your research, you might want to think about, could you use surveys in your research project? What would be one of the strengths of surveys for your research idea, and what would be one of the weaknesses? So if you'd like to, please pause the recording and have a reflect on that before moving on to the next slide, where we share our own assessment of some of the strengths and the weaknesses of surveys. So some of the strengths of surveys are that they can be used to explore a wide range of topics and research questions. They have the potential to be very quick and kind of a low resource method, so that there's the potential to generate data from lots of people very quickly. It doesn't always work like that. Sometimes you might need to put some time and energy into recruitment because participants are kind of hard to engage and so on. And as I've mentioned, because if you deliver a survey online or even through post, geography isn't a barrier, that you can access people all throughout the country or all throughout the world. And if people are reluctant to commit to an interview, they might be willing to take part in a survey. There's some interesting research in sex research that looks at how methods shape people's willingness to take part in sex research, which is obviously very sensitive. And what this research shows is that the most popular method, the one that most people will be willing to kind of take part in, is surveys. So surveys are seen as kind of more accessible to participants, kind of less threatening than other techniques. So as I've mentioned, people have lots of flexibility in how they engage with the survey, when they complete it, if they do it in one sitting or over several. And as mentioned, the data can be really varied because you've got a larger participant group, that you can get a sense of the range and diversity of experiences and perspectives rather than focusing on a particular aspect of experience. And surveys may be ethically less challenging than kind of face-to-face and interactive methods. So they, from an ethical perspective, they can open up possibilities research that wouldn't be there for interacting directly with participants. And because of the convenience and the strong sense of felt anonymity, people might be willing to take part in a survey study when they wouldn't be willing to kind of take part in an interview. So there's a saying, I'm going to get it wrong, the pond you fish in determines the fish you catch. So using surveys may mean you get access to different groups of people than you would if you were using interviews or focus groups or other methods. So let's end by considering some of the downsides or the weaknesses of surveys. So they're less flexible, they're less organic than in-person and face-to-face methods. So you don't have that opportunity for clarification, you don't have that opportunity for kind of follow-up, and you don't have that opportunity for spontaneity. So if participants mention something interesting that hadn't occurred to you to ask about, you can kind of dive in and follow up on that in an interview. You can't do that in a survey. But one technique that some of my students have used that they found really useful is doing a follow-up survey. So in the first survey, ask for people's permission to kind of contact them again, and then do an initial analysis of the data, and then send the people that were willing a kind of follow-up survey with some additional follow-up questions. Obviously, it doesn't give you the same opportunities for individualized follow-up and clarification that you would have in an interview, but nonetheless, there is that possibility of follow-up. Data generally has less depth compared to face-to-face methods, so you're going to get less data from a participant. So if you're going to do 6 interviews, then you'd probably want 20-30 survey responses, so you have a sufficient amount of data for your analysis. But as I've mentioned, surveys tend to be very focused and very on topic. It's very easy for interviews to drift and for people to kind of start talking about something that isn't kind of directly relevant to your research. So you have to have the sort of confidence to kind of gently steer them back on topic, which can be hard to do when you're first starting out as an interviewer. They're not suited to all participants. They're not necessarily easily accessible for people who are blind and partially sighted or use e-readers or voice recognition software. It will depend on survey format and modality. So Qualtrics is pretty good on the accessibility front, but obviously hard copy completion, email completion may be more challenging for some participants. There's no structure or time frame for completion. This can be great. This is where the flexibility comes in that I've mentioned earlier, but it also means that participants have to be motivated to take part because they haven't got a set time to sit down with an interviewer and talk to them. So they do have to be motivated enough to complete the survey. And it might be the case that sensitive information isn't revealed, that a skilled and experienced interviewer who's able to kind of gently kind of prompt and probe people can elicit lots of information from people. But I think on balance, you're more likely to get intimate disclosures in surveys than you would do in interviews, but it obviously depends on the topic and the interviewer and so on. But certainly my experience is those intimate disclosures come in surveys more so than they do in interviews. So this is the first of 2 slides providing you with references that we've cited, but also some further resources on qualitative surveys. So we have a talk by Ginny Brown on YouTube on qualitative surveys that you might want to listen to. Ginny and I have also written a blog post on qualitative surveys that you might find useful. In our book, Successful Qualitative Research, we discuss surveys, and we've also written a paper about qualitative surveys. And then in a chapter in a handbook on critical social psychology, we talk about innovations in qualitative methods and provide surveys as an example of an innovative method, in the sense that it's a technique that's traditionally been used in quantitative research. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a method that's really kind of taken off during the pandemic when there were restrictions on in-person data collection. So it's become a method that is, in a very short period of time, was something quite unusual and novel and people were skeptical about, to something that's become part of the standard toolkit for qualitative research. And then finally we have the paper by Louise Davey, if you want to have a read of that, and then a chapter by Ginny Brown and Gareth Terry on qualitative survey methods, and this is the source where they talk about felt anonymity. So if you're interested in surveys, I'd definitely recommend have a read of this chapter, and the link takes you to the book in the library where you can read the chapter. Okay, that's the end of part 2. I will see you again for part 3 on story-based methods.